There is a city in America where the mall is still open, sort of. The stores inside haven't sold anything since Reagan was president, but the building is still standing. The food court signs are still up. The carpet is still there, matted down, faded, the color of a memory you can't quite place. And somewhere in the parking lot, someone left a 1986 Buick Skylark that never got towed. It's still there. It belongs to the city now. Nobody talks about this place. Not really. You won't see it on a travel blog. You won't find it on a list of hidden gems or charming small towns, because it's not charming, it's not hidden. It's just stopped. Like someone hit pause on an entire American city in the year 1987 and forgot to press play. And here's the wild part: people still live there. We're going to talk about the steel town that watched its entire reason for existing evaporate in a single decade. We're going to talk about the main street that looks exactly like a movie set for a 1980s film. Except nobody is filming anything and the diner still serves coffee. We're going to talk about how an entire American population just decided to leave slowly, quietly, over 40 years, and what happened to the people who stayed behind. And we're going to talk about why, and this is the part that nobody is saying out loud, why some of those people who stayed might actually be onto something. Maybe, possibly, stick with us. But first, let me tell you about a place called Youngstown, Ohio. Because Youngstown is where this story starts. And Youngstown is where American history gets genuinely uncomfortable. Here is a fact that sounds made up. In 1930, Youngstown, Ohio was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the entire United States. Not in Ohio, in America, the entire country. Youngstown had more millionaires per square mile than almost anywhere else on the map. The houses were enormous, the restaurants were packed, the theaters were glittering. If you were a steelworker in Youngstown in 1955, you were pulling a salary that, adjusted for inflation, would absolutely embarrass what most American workers make today. The steel mills ran 24 hours a day. The smoke was so thick over the Manning Valley that it blocked out the sun. People called it the heavens. They meant it as a compliment. Imagine this. You're standing on Federal Street in downtown Youngstown on a Tuesday afternoon in 1965. The street is alive. There are department stores on both sides, actual department stores, not just a Walgreens and a vape shop like God intended. There's a movie theater playing something with Cary Grant. There are businessmen in actual suits walking actual briefcases to actual meetings that matter. The smell of steaks cooking drifts. Out of the restaurant on the corner, a real restaurant, white tablecloths, the whole thing, the sound of a city working, the low rumble of the mills in the distance like a heartbeat. This is America in full swing. This is what people meant when they said the American dream. And Youngstown had more of it than almost anywhere else. The 1977 happened September 19, 1977. They call it Black Monday in Youngstown, and not in a financial metaphor way, they literally named a specific Monday. On that morning, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company announced it was shutting down its Campbell Works. 5,000 workers, gone, not laid off temporarily. Gone. The ripple hit so fast that economists still use it as a textbook example. By 1980, the mills were closing in a cascade. By 1987, there's that year again, the last major steel operation in Youngstown had shut its doors. 40,000 steel jobs vanished in less than a decade, in a city of roughly 115,000 people. You want to understand what that does to a city? Imagine your town's single largest employer, the one that feeds not just its own workers but every restaurant, every car dealer, every plumber, every barber in the county. Imagine it just evaporates, not slowly, fast, psychologically, economically, demographically. Youngstown lost nearly a third of its population between 1970 and 1990, and it never stopped losing people after that. The city that had 170,000 people in 1960 sits today at around 60,000. That is not population decline. That is a population collapse. That is a city that demographically looks like someone pulled a drain plug. But here's what nobody tells you: the buildings didn't leave. The buildings stayed exactly where they were, and that's where things get genuinely strange. Most cities, when they decline, they at least renovate the decline. They put up a Dollar General where the department store was. They turn the old factory into a brewery because apparently every American city decided simultaneously in 2012 that abandoned factories should become breweries. There's a formula. The decline gets aestheticized. It gets brunchified. It gets a mural of a fox wearing a scarf. Youngstown skipped that phase. Youngstown went directly from thriving to haunted without stopping for the in-between awkward makeover. And so what you actually have right now in 2026 is a city where the bones of 1987 are still fully visible. The architecture is intact. The old theaters are still standing, most of them. The old neighborhood grocery stores, the kind that had a butcher and a real produce section, the buildings are still there. The signage is sun-bleached and cracked, but it's still readable. You can still see what was advertised. You can still read the phone numbers with 7 digits and no area code. Because in 1987, you didn't need an area code in Youngstown. Everyone you were calling was in Youngstown. Walk through certain parts of the Manning Valley and you will see entire residential streets where half the houses are gone, not deteriorated, actually physically removed by the city in demolition programs, and the other half are just sitting there. Intact, curtains in the windows, porch furniture, a basketball hoop in the driveway that hasn't had a ball through it since the Bush administration. The first one. And it is one of the most emotionally disorienting experiences available to any American who wants to understand what happened to this country after the 1980s. But that's nothing compared to what we find when we go deeper into the valley, because Youngstown was the biggest domino, but it wasn't the only one. About 45 minutes south of Youngstown, down through the rolling edges of eastern Ohio, there is a town called East Liverpool, population around 11,000 today, which sounds modest until you learn it used to be 30,000, and until you understand that East Liverpool was once genuinely the pottery capital of the world. Not Ohio, the world, the pottery capital of the world. You can still buy a house in East Liverpool for less than a used pickup truck, not a new pickup truck. A used one? We're talking $15,000 to $25,000 for a full house with multiple bedrooms, a yard, a porch, and neighbors who will absolutely wave at you because there are not enough people left in East Liverpool to be unfriendly to the ones who remain. Here's the dream, because there is a dream here. East Liverpool sits on the Ohio River. The river views are legitimately beautiful in a way that would cost you $500,000 in literally any other state. The town has history packed into every building, Victorian-era architecture, old ceramic murals, the bones of an industrial past that was genuinely grand. The surrounding hills are green and quiet. There are people in East Liverpool right now today who have 2,000 square foot houses with river views who pay less in property taxes annually than a Manhattan resident pays for a parking space per month. But here's what nobody tells you. East Liverpool made national news in 2016 for reasons that had nothing to do with pottery. The opioid crisis hit the Ohio Valley like a freight train, and East Liverpool was in the direct path. An image of a couple collapsed in a car with a 4-year-old child in the back seat was published by the local police department and went viral. It was described by every major outlet as a defining image of the opioid epidemic. East Liverpool became a symbol, not of pottery, not of river views, of what happens to American towns when the economy abandons them and fills the vacuum with something worse. The local hospital, in 2017, reported responding to multiple overdose calls in a single day repeatedly. The county coroner described conditions that sounded less like Ohio and more like a public health catastrophe. And underneath all of it was the simple, brutal fact. When the pottery industry left, when the economy collapsed, when the young people left for Columbus or Pittsburgh or anywhere, what filled the void wasn't a brewery. It wasn't a mural of a fox wearing a scarf. The Wi-Fi in East Liverpool is fine, actually. The Wi-Fi is not the problem. The problem is 40 years of economic neglect that left a beautiful town on a beautiful river with almost no economic infrastructure and a population that skews old, tired, and heartbroken. Would you move there for $18,000 and a river view? Actually answer that question. Think about it. We'll come back to it. Now let me tell you about a place where time didn't just slow down. It actually physically stopped. And I want you to understand that I am not being metaphorical. Centralia, Pennsylvania, population 4. I said 4, the number between 3 and 5. 4 human beings officially live in Centralia, Pennsylvania. And technically the town is still on the map. It has a zip code. It has a mayor. It has roads, or had roads. Most of them have been ripped up by the state. It has a church. One of the churches is still standing. There are people who still come to visit that church, in a town of 4 residents. Here is why. In 1962, someone lit a trash fire in a landfill that happened to be sitting above an abandoned coal mine. The fire caught the coal seam. And the coal seam, because coal is not interested in your schedule or your emotional well-being, just kept burning. Underground, silently, invisibly. The coal seam under Centralia has been on fire for over 60 years. It will, according to geological estimates, continue burning for another 250 years. The ground temperature in certain spots has been measured at 900 degrees. The highway Route 61, which used to run through town, cracked open, giant fissures, steam rising from the pavement. The state closed the highway in 1994. It's still closed. You can still walk on it. The cracks are still there. Graffiti artists have turned the broken road into an art installation. Kids from across the country come to spray paint a dead highway in a ghost town that is literally smoldering beneath their feet. Imagine this. You're standing on what's left of Centralia's main street on a November morning. The fog is low. The temperature is maybe 38 degrees. Your breath comes out white. The houses are gone. The state bought them all out and demolished them one by one over the 1980s and 90s. So where 1,100 people used to live, there are now just lots. Empty lots with the concrete foundations still visible. A grid of streets that go nowhere, that connect nothing to nothing. The street signs are still up. The stop signs are still there, but there are no cars. There's just the mist and the distant smell of sulfur from the burning earth. And somewhere under your feet, a fire that has been burning since John F. Kennedy was alive. And then you notice it, rising from the ground, just barely visible, just a thin wisp against the gray sky. Steam. The earth is warm here, it's always warm. In December, when everything around Centralia is frozen solid, certain patches of ground in this ghost town are green, because the heat from below prevents frost. Plants grow in December in a place where everyone left and nothing should grow. And if you press your hand against the earth in the right spot, the ground is warm, like it's alive. Like the town is still breathing. Nobody tells you that part. The town of Centralia stopped being a town in the 1980s. The evacuation really accelerated after 1981, when a 12-year-old named Todd Domboski fell into a sinkhole in his grandmother's backyard and grabbed a tree root to keep from falling into a steam vent with temperatures reaching 350 degrees. He survived. He was 12. And Centralia's fate as a ghost town was essentially sealed. By 1987, there's that year again, the population had dropped from 1,100 to under 100. Today it's 4, but here's the thing that gets under your skin. The holdouts, the people who refused to leave, they were serious about it. They fought the state in court. They argued their homes were fine, that the threat was overstated, that they'd been born there and intended to die there. Several of them did die there of old age in their homes in a town where the ground was on fire. There is something in that story that is either deeply American or deeply something else. I leave that to you. But that's not even the strangest frozen place in this video, because there's a whole city, not a town, a city that did the same thing at a much larger scale, and where it ended up is both more hopeful and somehow more haunting than Centralia. Stay with me. Let's talk about Gary, Indiana. And I want to acknowledge up front that Gary, Indiana gets used as a punchline so often that most people have forgotten it was once one of the most strategically important cities in America. Gary was purpose-built. Literally, U.S. Steel bought the land in 1906 and constructed an entire city from scratch on the southern shore of Lake Michigan. They built it to make steel. They built the houses for the steelworkers. They built the churches, the schools, the infrastructure. Gary was a company town from day one, and for a while that was exactly what made it extraordinary. By 1960, Gary had 178,000 residents. It had opera, it had jazz clubs, it had a downtown that people from Chicago came to visit. It had the Marquette Park Beach on Lake Michigan, which is genuinely one of the most beautiful stretches of freshwater beach in the Midwest, and is almost completely unknown to the rest of America because when people think Gary, Indiana, they don't think beach. Gary, Indiana produced Harold Washington, who became the first black mayor of Chicago. Gary produced the Jackson 5. Michael Jackson was born in Gary in a small house on Jackson Street. Yes, they named the street after the family, though technically the street name came first, and that house is still there. It's been preserved as a museum. In Gary, Indiana, a city that has been the subject of more urban decay journalism than almost any other American municipality. Michael Jackson's childhood bedroom is 15 minutes from what looks, in certain neighborhoods, like a war zone. Because here's what happened to Gary. U.S. Steel started cutting production in the 1970s. And then in the early 1980s, automation, international competition, and the general collapse of American manufacturing hit Gary the same way it hit Youngstown, the same way it hit every steel town from Pennsylvania to Illinois. Except Gary's collapse was faster and harder and more visible because Gary was also dealing with white flight in a way that compounded every economic problem into something that looked, by 1987, genuinely catastrophic. The city that had 178,000 people in 1960 has fewer than 70,000 today. Entire neighborhoods exist as open lots. There are churches in Gary that are structurally intact, architecturally stunning, actual Gothic-style stone churches built in the 1920s that have been sitting empty for 30 years. The pews are still inside some of them. The stained glass is still in the windows. The silence inside them is so complete it sounds like something. The City Methodist Church, look it up, actually look it up, is a ruin that looks like it belongs in a European war documentary. Collapsed roof open to the sky, trees growing up through the floor, afternoon light streaming down through where the ceiling used to be onto the remains of wooden pews. It is one of the most visually extraordinary places in the United States of America. It is in Gary, Indiana. It is 15 minutes from Chicago. Almost nobody goes there, and here is the twist that nobody is telling you. Gary, Indiana has a beach, a genuinely beautiful Lake Michigan beach with sand dunes. Indiana Dunes National Park, a national park federally designated with real resources and real infrastructure, is right there. Gary is right there, the same city. And as remote work has slowly, tentatively, begun to change where Americans can live, a small but measurable number of people have started looking at Gary's lakefront properties and doing math that looks completely insane until it doesn't. You can buy a house in Gary, Indiana, a real house, not a condemned shell, an actual livable house, for under $40,000. In some neighborhoods under $20,000, with Lake Michigan within reasonable driving distance, with Chicago less than an hour away, with property tax so low it almost doesn't register. Is Gary safe? No. Gary's crime rate is among the highest in the country, and that is not a small caveat. That is a significant and serious reality that anyone thinking about Gary needs to understand fully before making any decisions. The violent crime rate in Gary is not a quirk. It's a genuine danger. And this is the uncomfortable, but the city is also changing. Not fast. Not in ways that look like a before and after renovation show. But the population that remained in Gary is there because they chose to be there. And the community that exists in Gary is real and resilient and deeply, specifically attached to that place in ways that people who have never lived somewhere struggling genuinely don't understand. There are people in Gary who know every name on their block, who have a relationship with their city that most Americans who live in perfectly maintained suburbs never develop. There is something in the bones of Gary that is still alive. The question is whether that's enough. And by the way, the potholes in Gary have their own gravity wells. Scientists are studying them. Geologists have theorized that certain Gary potholes may connect directly to Earth's mantle. I'm not confirming this, but I'm also not denying it. Would you live in Gary for $25,000 and a house that's bigger than your current apartment? I'm genuinely asking. But here's the thing I haven't told you yet. The thing that ties all of these places together. The thing that nobody in the mainstream conversation about forgotten America actually says. All of these places, Youngstown, East Liverpool, Centralia, Gary, they didn't die because of bad luck. They didn't freeze in time because of some random cosmic accident. They froze because of decisions. Specific, documented, traceable decisions made by specific corporations and specific trade policies and specific political choices over a period of about 15 years between 1975 and 1990. And 1987 sits right in the middle of that window. Right in the gut of it. 1987 is the year that, if you were living in the Manning Valley or in the Calumet region of Indiana or in any of the other 100 steel and manufacturing towns across the Rust Belt, you could see the shape of what was coming. The jobs weren't coming back. The promise that had organized your entire life, go to the mill, work hard, buy the house, your kids go to the school, your wife shops downtown, your father retires with a pension, that promise was gone. And everybody kind of knew it, but nobody had quite admitted it yet. 1987 is the year the future stopped arriving in these places. And the infrastructure, the buildings, the layouts, the commercial districts, they reflect exactly the moment the future stopped. Because development requires investment, and investment requires confidence in the future. And when confidence in the future collapses, everything literally stays exactly as it was at the moment of collapse. That's what frozen in time actually means. It doesn't mean cute and quaint. It means the exact moment a community's belief in its own tomorrow ran out, preserved in brick and asphalt and sun-faded signs until someone comes along and notices. There is a diner in Youngstown, I'm not going to tell you the name because I don't want it to become a tourist attraction before it's ready for that, where the menu hasn't changed since 1991. The prices haven't changed since 1994. The booths are the same booths, the counter stools spin, the coffee comes in those short white mugs that feel like they belong in a different America. The woman who works the morning shift has been working the morning shift since 1989. She knows every regular by name, by order, by what's going on in their life. She knows who lost a job and who's getting by and who just had a grandkid. She has not been replaced by an app. She has not been replaced by a QR code menu. She is still there at 6 a.m. every morning and the coffee costs $1, $50 and the eggs are real eggs and the toast comes out of a toaster that has been making toast in Youngstown, Ohio since the early 1990s. Tell me that's not worth something. Go ahead, I'll wait. Now, I told you at the beginning that I was saving the biggest one for last, and I meant it. Because everything we've talked about, Youngstown's collapse, East Liverpool's river views and heartbreak, Centralia's underground fire, Gary's frozen cathedrals, all of it is prelude to the place I'm about to tell you about. Because there is a city in America that does all of those things simultaneously. A city that has the ruins and the affordable housing and the complicated crime statistics and the unexpected beauty and the genuine community and the specific dateable moment in the 1980s when its trajectory changed. And this city, unlike the others, has recently started to do something that nobody predicted, something so surprising that the people who have been writing the obituary for this type of American city for 40 years have had to stop and reconsider. Detroit. I know, you've heard of Detroit, you think you know Detroit, you've seen the photos of the Packard plant, you've seen the headlines, you think Detroit is a symbol of American collapse and that you already understand what it means. You don't, not yet. Here's what you don't know about Detroit. In 1950, Detroit was the fourth largest city in the United States. Not Michigan, the United States. There were 1.8 million people in the city of Detroit proper. The auto industry was at its absolute peak and Detroit was where it all happened. The houses they built in Detroit in the 1910s through the 1940s, the craftsman bungalows, the Art Deco apartment buildings, the enormous Victorian mansions on streets like Boston Edison, where Henry Ford himself once lived, are some of the finest residential architecture in America. built by skilled tradespeople who took pride in their work because the money was there and the time was there and the community was there to demand it. And then the same forces hit Detroit that hit everywhere else. White flight in the 1950s and 60s, deindustrialization in the 70s. The 1973 oil crisis destroyed the American auto market's appetite for the cars Detroit built. The crack epidemic hit Detroit's neighborhoods in the 1980s. The riots of 1967 had already accelerated middle-class flight to the suburbs. And by 1987, there is that year one more time Detroit's population had already fallen below 1 million. By 2013, when Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, there were about 680,000 people in a city built for 1.8 million. Empty. Not empty the way a room is empty. Empty the way a cathedral is empty on a Tuesday at noon. Enormous, architecturally magnificent, historically resonant, and quiet in a way that makes you feel the weight of everyone who isn't there. There are neighborhoods in Detroit where you can stand in the middle of the street and look in every direction and see no other human being. Where the trees, because nature does not wait for human permission, have grown up through the floors of abandoned houses and out through the roofs. Where urban prairie has replaced what were once dense residential neighborhoods. There are places in Detroit where the city has simply returned to grassland, in a major American city, in the 21st century. The Packard plant, 3.5 million square feet of abandoned industrial space, sat as a ruin for decades before it was finally purchased and redevelopment began. The Michigan Central Station, a Beaux Arts masterpiece that had been empty since 1988, sat hollow for 30 years. Its windows were blown out, pigeons nested in the waiting room where hundreds of thousands of soldiers had shipped off to World War II. The marble floors were still there. The ticket counters were still there. The clock was still there, everything was still there, just empty and slowly falling into itself. And then something happened, something that nobody who was paying attention to Detroit in 2010 thought was possible. Ford Motor Company bought Michigan Central Station. They restored it, and I mean restored it. The thing is open now, it's beautiful, it looks like 1913 again. And it sits in a neighborhood, Corktown, Detroit's oldest neighborhood, that has, against literally every economic prediction made about it over the last 40 years, come back, not fully, not easily, not without complicated questions about who is coming back and who is being left out, but back. The restaurants are packed on weekends. The housing prices in Corktown have gone from, I can't believe a whole house costs this little, to wait, these are going for how much now? The Detroit housing market as a whole did something in the 2010s and 2020s that economists called impossible. It started recovering, not everywhere, not evenly. Not without the very real and very valid concerns about gentrification displacing the people who stayed through the hard decades. But it moved. The frozen thing started to thaw. And here is the detail that hits different when you've been listening to this whole story. The people who stayed in Detroit through the bankruptcy, through the abandonment, through the years when the city couldn't keep the streetlights on, through the fire hydrants that didn't work, through the decades of being the national symbol of American failure, those people built something. Community organizations, urban farms on the empty lots, block clubs, art spaces in abandoned buildings. They built a Detroit that was small and struggling and deeply human in a way that a city of 1.8 million never. The city that froze in time built a new thing inside the freeze. A smaller, stranger, more complicated, more intimate thing. And now the people who wrote it off are starting to show up. Imagine this. It's a Saturday morning in Detroit in the spring. You're on the East Riverfront, which has been completely redeveloped into a park that runs along the Detroit River with a view of Windsor, Canada, directly across the water. The morning light comes across the river gold and flat. There are people running, walking dogs, sitting on benches. Behind you, the downtown skyline, smaller than it was in 1987, stranger with its glass towers and its vacant lots side by side, catches the light in a way that's genuinely beautiful. And you think, this is still here. After everything, it's still here. A house in Detroit's outer neighborhoods is still $30,000 to $60,000. The property taxes, even with recent increases, remain dramatically lower than comparable Midwestern cities. The airport is excellent. The food scene, built largely by the immigrant communities that never left, Middle Eastern, Mexican, Polish, Black, Southern, is extraordinary in ways that food tourists haven't fully discovered yet. The music history, the architecture, the river. The people who stayed and built something inside the ruin. Is Detroit fixed? No. Is Detroit safe everywhere? Absolutely not, and that is a serious and non-dismissible reality. Is the story of who benefits from Detroit's revival one that demands honest and uncomfortable examination? Yes, all of that is true. And also true, there is a city in America where time froze in 1987 and something grew in the freeze. Something tough and specific and not quite like anything else in this country. Something that was formed by loss and stayed anyway. Because I've been to these places, or I know people who have. And every single time they come back saying the same thing. They expected ruin, they expected sadness, they expected a postcard of decline. What they didn't expect was to feel for the first time in a long time, like they were in a place that was real. So I'll leave you with this. If you had to pick one of these cities, Youngstown, East Liverpool, Gary, Centralia, if you're extremely committed to a unique experience and also fire, Detroit, which would you actually consider? Drop it in the comments. And while you're there, tell me, what does it say about America that the most real feeling places left are the ones that got left behind? Subscribe if you want more of these, because we've got a video coming about the American towns so cheap that people from California are genuinely moving there, and the locals are not sure how they feel about it. It's going to be uncomfortable in the best possible way.